Russian army recruitment has taken a massive nosedive as recruitment falls even in their most lucrative recruitment centers. Just what does this mean for the Russian war effort? Who are the only people still signing up for the one-way trip to Ukraine in the Russian army? Plus, we're going to talk about the Russian crisis in military hardware, especially their armored vehicles. And of course, Ukraine's counter to Russia's FPV optical drones, and a bad day for Russian oil. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay, so this is one of the things we talked about in an earlier video, that the Russian army's recruitment appears to be falling by 80%, right? For context, this is recruitment centers in Moscow. And what's notable about Moscow is that that is actually ground zero for the massive bonuses, right? The Russian government reportedly offering bonuses up to $20,000, but only if you sign up in the Moscow recruitment station, right? They seem to be prorating recruitment paydouts based on the location that you sign up in. And this means that a lot of these recruits were actually taking buses to Moscow to sign up so they could get the maximum sign-on bonus. And that makes a lot of sense, honestly, for their families. But that means that the most lucrative area is still experiencing a massive drop. In fact, recruitment centers are reporting just 40 applicants a day. In the summer, for example, they saw 200 to 250 signing up. So that means that we're looking at only about 20%, less than 20% of the previous normal is now what they're getting. And right, they said, quote, in August, we could barely cope. People came en masse, 200 to 250 a day, according to the Moscow mayor's office. But now they're seeing far fewer, right? And this makes sense, right? There's a limit to how many able-bodied men are willing to sign up for this one-way trip. And when you're talking about these extremely lucrative paydays of, if you bring it into the United States, it's roughly between $800,000 and $1.2 million. If you add the sign-on bonus, the elimination bonus, and a year of combat service in between, if you can live that long. And so for these Russian recruits, right? The answer is everyone who would sign up for any amount of money has signed up. The only people left, right, appear to be foreigners lured by these paydays. And of course, a handful of Russians who end up in deep legal trouble. One man who said he was from Bangladesh said he went to a recruitment center to sign up after one of his friends successfully enlisted and invited him to join for the money. He said, quote, I'm a student. My family financial condition is not good. I need to support them. Another foreign fighter was from Ghana, also invited by a friend who saw an opportunity to fulfill his dream of going to war. Well, you're going to get what you wanted, buddy. Right? Now, of course, as we've talked about, foreign fighters generally treated as a class below the Russian military. And, well, frankly, even the Russian military is treated pretty poorly. So the lifespan of these conscripts is not going to be very long. But the real question is, how is Russia going to sustain this fight going forward? Now, before we talk about the other issue facing the Russian military, I wanted to take a second and tell you about today's sponsor. For the average Russian, their government's failed policies have translated into skyrocketing inflation. For Russians that have their wealth stored primarily in rubles, this has meant that the actual value of their savings has been cut in half. And while Putin is exceptionally bad, Moscow isn't the only government mismanaging their finances. The US government continues to grow more and more into debt every year, and the best hedge is always going to be keeping your wealth invested in a diverse mix of assets. That includes precious metals like gold and silver. What I think is cool about the gold that I have is that it's been a currency for thousands of years. My gold coins would have value in 500 BC Athens, 500 AD Amsterdam, and 2025 Auckland. My wife still has the gold coins that her grandparents took with them when they fled Cuba. If you're interested in protecting your wealth through precious metals, I wanted to tell you about today's sponsor, Lear Capital. Lear Capital makes it easy to protect your wealth with gold and silver. They've been around for 27 years with thousands of 5-star reviews and over 3 billion in trusted transactions. And they offer a 24-hour risk-free purchase guarantee. Change your mind? Full refund. Take action now. Call Lear Capital at 855-271-1871. That's 855-271-1871. Or visit trylear.com/combat to get your free wealth protection kit. And if you open a qualified account, you could get up to $15,000 in bonus coins. Don't wait until it's too late. Secure your future with gold and silver today by calling 855-271-1871. Okay, now let's take a look at the other side of the coin, right? You have the Russian personnel, but personnel are only part of it, right? Certainly, the Russians also need equipment. And they are having a huge problem as they, for 2 years, have been looting Soviet-era military stockpiles, right? These are old Soviet-era tanks, BMPs, and other equipment from that era that were just sitting in large-scale storage yards, right? And one of the things that Russia did is first, it pulled out all of its active duty tanks. They were all destroyed by drones. Then they pulled out all the tanks that could still kind of run in these old boneyards, and those were all destroyed. Then Russia had to turn to what is cannibalizing, is what it's called. When they find tanks that can't run, they say, listen, we have a tank that has a broken, let's say a broken tread here and a bad engine here. They say, listen, take the tread off the tank with the bad engine and put it on this. So now you have one tank that's even more broken and one tank that can go into combat. And so the result, though, is that Russia is now depleting even that Soviet-era military stockpile, right? It's expected that the ability of the Russian military to sustain this fight into late this year or early next year is going to become a crisis as they run low on tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery, right? Now, they're saying, according to the investigative report, that Russian losses have hit about 50% of the total stock. But remember, in the scenario we just described, right, a tank that is missing one part in order to be functional gets cannibalized from tank B, right? So for every tank that rolls out, there should be one tank left behind. Now, real cannibalization is going to work like this because you, on one hand, can sit there and have a tank that goes, hey, this tank needs 3 parts. So 1, 2, 3 tanks that are deadlined get fed parts to keep this tank rolling. The other side of the coin can also happen where you sit there and go, hey, here's 3 tanks. One needs a tread, one needs a turret, one needs an engine. And they say, well, here's one tank that has a broken loading system. They say, great, all 3 of these tanks can get up and running from this one. But I think as a general principle, 1-to-1 is about right. And so this 50% of the stock remaining is not 50%. It does not mean that the Ukrainians are halfway to eliminating Russia's tank production. It's more like they are 85 to 90% through the Russian tanks. Because I would be willing to bet that currently every one of those tanks currently in the boneyards still is unable to run, right? Now, they're saying the number of combat-ready vehicles Russia could get to the front line is estimated around 2,000 tanks, 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and 3,000 APCs. I have a hard time even believing that. Moscow can ramp up production, but by ramping up production, they say literally about 500 units of a BMP-3 or a modern BTR-82 can only get about 400 units annually. Now, here's the problem, is that for Russia, their tactics aren't as armor heavy as they used to be, right? Now they're relying on small 3 to 4 man teams that push across a broad front, expose the Ukrainians' fighting positions, and then take those positions out with drones. And while there's still armored combat happening, there's still been some viral videos that we've taken a look at over on Combat Vet News where we see this level of fighting taking place, armored combat, right? Armored forces on armored forces. You aren't seeing it at scale, right? In most areas of the front line, it's infantry combat and it's drone combat. So again, this is an interesting sort of juxtaposition because Russia has to project strength, right? It's going to project strength even as its military begins to stumble on the battlefield. And this is hard because for Ukraine, with a freer press, they are going to have their issues broadcast more publicly, whereas Russia, with its state-censored media, is not going to have its problems broadcast in the same way. And so when you pick up a newspaper, you're going to read about the Ukrainian problems. You're not going to read about the Russian problems, but that doesn't mean they aren't there. And Ukraine has one huge advantage here, and that is that they are on the defensive. They are willing to trade space to preserve their manpower, and they are continually getting backfilled by the West. So as long as Ukraine can continue to get robust material support, as long as Russia continues to be subject to sanctioning, right, you potentially have this material shift as Russia gets fewer and fewer new recruits. Again, a Russian military operating with 80% effectiveness is going to not really be able to make any meaningful gains. And the most important thing is that Ukraine, with a lower tempo of operations, is going to be able to shore up its forces. And because it's on defense, every additional personnel that Ukraine gets is going to actually be more effective towards achieving their defensive goals than one additional Russian personnel. And so, right, but that means, of course, that if Ukraine pivots to the offense, all bets are off, right? They are going to incur a lot, potentially, of casualties. So, but what does that mean? What are the tools that Ukraine is now using to counter Russia's most modern battlefield equipment, like fiber optic drones? And this has been $1 million question, because fiber optic drones are really, really tough to counter because they are tethered, right? It's basically a fishing spool of fiber optics that spools out as the drone flies. Imagine, for example, that the FPV operator is a fisherman, and the drone is actually the lure at the end of his fishing line. A fiber optic drone gets cast out, and the lure flies off, spooling out the line of fishing lure or fishing line, right? But that fishing line is a fiber optic cable that is thin, but it connects the drone operators. Sends the drone back to the operator, and the operator's commands go out to the drone. So it means that jamming no longer applies to a fiber optic drone. Now, how do you stop something? How do you stop an unjammable drone? Well, one Ukrainian military unit actually reportedly developed a way to counter this weapon using, instead of jamming, they devised a mobile system which has small mobile radars providing early warning for incoming FPV drones from a few kilometers away. And then once they detect the threat, the unit then launches its own interceptor drones to get the Russian ones before they can reach their targets, right? Now, this is according to, again, the head of MHGR's Birds, the elite, one of the best drone units in the Ukrainian military. In fact, they posted on Telegram reportedly a video showing one of the drones taking out a Russian fiber optic drone, right? And we're going to take a look at this again over on Combat Vet News because YouTube won't let me show you combat footage. No shocker there. But the important thing to take away is that while this isn't a universal perfect system, right? This mobile radar, for example, it's likely that a low-flying drone can get under the radar, so to speak, right? Or sort of hide in and around structures and other objects. It's still going to be very hard because remember, it's spooling out fiber optic cable. And while it's really hard to snag it, it's not impossible, right? And the radar, especially if you were able to somehow combine the radar with some kind of audio listening, because those drone engines make a really high-pitched whine. And if you were able to combine those two, you would really potentially end up in a place where you could reliably and at scale detect these FPV drones. But again, the best solution, as we've seen, is the one that works today. Here's an example, again, of this Russian FPV drone. You can see that here's the fiber optic spool. It's actually quite large. Here's the warhead, and here's the drone itself, right? And they actually are easier to take out with these interceptor drones because the extra weight of the large spools makes these drones less maneuverable, meaning they are more sitting targets. You're probably thinking to yourself, man, this feels exactly like what happened in the First World War, where you had, of course, initially you had reconnaissance planes, and then you developed early sort of proto-bombing planes, and then you had the first fighter jets meant to stop these enemy planes from bombing or conducting reconnaissance. And as that evolved, you ended up with these three roles sort of becoming specialized, right? You had specialized interceptor aircraft, you had specialized bombing aircraft, and you had specialized reconnaissance aircraft. And that's the direction you're seeing these drones already start to go. Because again, those are really the three things that you have to do on a battlefield, which is protect yourself from the enemy, engage the enemy, and learn about the battlefield you're operating in. Those three things are just the three functions that you could need to do other than sustainment. And you're seeing that too. And actually, that's another use of aircraft, right? By World War II, you saw cargo aircraft behind the lines ferrying supplies, conducting sustainment operations. So a really interesting kind of perspective here and a sign of a real shift in the drone threat. Now, speaking of drones, they don't just operate as small FPV drones. The Ukrainians are also busy using their strike drones, their deep strike drones, to take out Russian oil refineries, right? A Lukoil refinery in the Russian oblast of Nizhny Novgorod struck by multiple Ukrainian drones, going 4 for 4. Sorry, I'm trying not to show them because YouTube is very mad at me for showing images of Russian oil refineries burning. Come on, man. The Ukrainians are out here winning the war and stopping climate change. What more could you ask for, guys? Right? There's been a lot of footage, of course, of these oil refineries going up in flames. And we know this is part of the strategy because the Russian war machine, right, is fueled not just by personnel, not just by equipment and munitions, but by money. Most important is money. And if the Ukrainians can damage the number one source of revenue for the Russian state, oil revenues, you're going to create a situation where the Russian ruble, right, is going to get pushed further and further down in value. And that is so important because, again, the pain, the Ukrainian strategy is to foist the pain of this war onto the Russian public, right? Because the Russian public understands, as we all do, that Russia was not an imminent threat from Ukraine. The Ukrainian military was never capable and is never capable of threatening Russia with any kind of scale. And the Ukrainians were never really moving any closer to NATO membership. None of those things were true. So, and the Russians know this. The Russian public knows this. So they know they're in a war of choice. So when their groceries become unaffordable, when their salaries don't allow them to rent an apartment, that is when they're going to start to say, hey, this needs to stop, right? And maybe not all Russians, maybe just Russian oligarchs that care about this sort of stuff, but that's enough, right? And we're seeing it. We're seeing the Russian public not want to sign up to fight in this war. A huge shift. And the more oil they take out, the worse the Russian economy looks. And so that is why Ukraine is continuing to strike these targets, because they are military targets, right? Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Huge thank you to folks like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmeling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, James Ola, and Henry Roussier, as well as all of our lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. I hope you join me over on Combat Vet News for today's videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.